My name is Claire Rousseau, and I can tell you the vintage, vineyard, and barrel aging of any wine from a single sip. I can detect flavor notes that most sommeliers miss entirely. I can identify counterfeit wines that fool expert collectors. I have what the industry calls a perfect palate, one of maybe a dozen people in the world with taste and scent perception at the absolute highest level. For 17 years, my family told me I couldn't taste anything at all. They told me I had ajusia, a genetic condition that destroyed my ability to perceive flavors. They told me I was noseblind, incapable of smelling the subtle aromatic compounds that make wine complex and beautiful. They told me I should be grateful they let me work in the cellars of the family winery, doing manual labor that didn't require the sensory gifts I would never possess. It was all a lie. I don't have ajusia, I never did. The medical diagnosis was fabricated, the genetic testing was falsified, and the specialist who confirmed my condition was paid to destroy my future so my family could steal my inheritance. My grandfather left me an $8 million stake in Rousseau Estates, one of California's most prestigious wineries. Under the terms of his will, I would receive my shares when I turned 25, unless I was deemed unable to participate meaningfully in the wine business due to medical incapacity. They made sure I was deemed incapable. But while they were building their careers on my stolen inheritance, I was building something else. I was becoming the Palate, an anonymous wine critic whose reviews could make or destroy a winery overnight, whose identity was the industry's greatest mystery, whose judgment was considered infallible. I reviewed my family's wines exactly once. I gave them 1 star out of 5. I called their flagship vintage, pretentious, derivative, and fundamentally dishonest, much like the people who made it. Their business collapsed within 6 months. And when they came desperately searching for investors to save them from bankruptcy, they discovered that the nose-blind girl they'd hidden in the cellars for 17 years now controlled their entire fate. This is the story of how I went from the family defect to the most powerful person in their world. This is the story of how perfect taste became perfect revenge. I need to start at the beginning, because the cruelty of what happened to me only makes sense if you understand the dynasty I was born into. The Rousseau family had been making wine in California for 4 generations. My great-great-grandfather emigrated from France in 1898, bringing old-world winemaking traditions to Napa Valley when it was still considered a backwater. Over the decades, the family built a reputation for exceptional wines that rivaled anything from Europe. By the time I was born, Rousseau Estates was legendary. We produced small-batch, high-end wines that sold for hundreds of dollars per bottle. We won international awards. We were featured in every major wine publication. The family name was synonymous with excellence, tradition, and uncompromising standards. My grandfather, Jean-Baptiste Rousseau, was the patriarch who transformed the winery from successful to iconic. He had an extraordinary palate, the ability to taste a wine and understand not just what it was, but what it could become. He could predict how a vintage would develop over 20 years, could blend different varietals into something transcendent, could identify problems in the fermentation process from the subtlest off-note. He used to tell me I had inherited his gift. I was his favorite grandchild, something that my cousins, André and Margit, resented deeply. Their parents, my Uncle Philippe and Aunt Celeste, ran the business side of the winery, but my grandfather always said that business acumen without sensory genius was just accounting. The real art of winemaking required the gift. And he believed I had it. I remember being 7 years old, sitting with him in the tasting room as he taught me the vocabulary of wine, how to identify tannins, acidity, fruit notes, terroir, how to let a wine breathe, how to perceive complexity, how to understand the story a vintage was telling. "You have the nose, petite," he would say. "I can tell already. You will be a great winemaker someday." My cousins would watch these sessions with barely concealed jealousy. André was 3 years older than me, Margit was 2 years older, and both had been raised to believe they would inherit the family legacy. The idea that their younger cousin, a girl, no less, might be more naturally talented was intolerable to them. But as long as my grandfather was alive, I was protected. He made sure I understood wine, made sure I learned the business, made sure I knew that I had a place in the family's future. And then, when I was 14, he died. The will reading changed everything. My grandfather left the winery to be run by my Uncle Philippe, with the understanding that operational control would remain in that branch of the family. My father, Jean-Baptiste's other son, had died when I was young, so I had no parent to represent my interests. But my grandfather had also left me something specific, a 20% stake in Rousseau Estates, held in trust until I turned 25. At that point, I would become a full partner with voting rights and profit sharing. The will included a provision that my grandfather had apparently added in the final months of his life. This stake is left to Claire in recognition of her exceptional sensory gifts and her potential to continue the family's winemaking tradition. I trust that she will use this inheritance to preserve our legacy of excellence. 20% might not sound like controlling interest, but in a family business, it was enormous. It meant I would have significant influence over major decisions. It meant I couldn't be ignored or marginalized. It meant I was, whether my family liked it or not, a major stakeholder. My Uncle Philippe's face when the lawyer read that provision was something I'll never forget. Not grief, calculation. His eyes moved to André and Margit, then to me, and I saw him doing the math. If I really did have the gift my grandfather claimed, if I really did become a talented winemaker, I would be a threat to his children's inheritance. I would have influence they couldn't override. I would be, despite being younger and less experienced, a power they would have to reckon with. Unless something happened to change that. The campaign started subtly, about 6 months after my grandfather died. My uncle began expressing concerns about my abilities. He mentioned to other family members that while my grandfather had doted on me, perhaps he had been seeing what he wanted to see rather than what was actually there. Jean-Baptiste loved Claire, but I'm not sure she really has the palate he thought she did, Philippe would say. She's enthusiastic, certainly, but enthusiasm isn't the same as talent. He started testing me in family settings, presenting wines and asking me to identify them, then dismissing my answers as lucky guesses or obvious conclusions. He would set up scenarios designed to make me look incompetent, like asking me to identify a wine while my cousins whispered wrong information nearby to confuse me. And slowly the family narrative shifted. I went from Jean-Baptiste's gifted granddaughter to the girl who thinks she has talent but doesn't really. Then came the medical diagnosis. I was 15 when my uncle insisted I see a specialist. He claimed he had noticed I was having trouble with certain sensory tasks and wanted to rule out any medical issues. The specialist, Dr. Raymond Castellane, who my uncle claimed was the foremost expert on gustatory disorders, conducted an examination. He tested my ability to identify flavors, to distinguish between similar compounds, to perceive subtle differences in taste and smell. And then he delivered his verdict. I had a rare genetic condition called congenital ageusia with associated anosmia. My ability to taste and smell was significantly impaired, not completely absent, but reduced to perhaps 20% of normal function. This is not something that can be treated, Dr. Castellane explained. It's a genetic defect in the taste receptors and olfactory neurons. You can perceive basic flavors, sweet, salty, bitter, sour, but the complex notes that make up wine appreciation will always be beyond your reach. I was devastated. Everything my grandfather had told me about my future, every dream I had of becoming a winemaker, was suddenly impossible. I couldn't make wine if I couldn't taste it. I couldn't honor my grandfather's legacy if I was fundamentally incapable of perceiving the subtleties he had valued. My uncle was sympathetic in that careful, practiced way that should have made me suspicious. "I'm so sorry, Claire. I know how much you wanted to follow in your grandfather's footsteps, but this explains why you've been struggling. It's not your fault, it's a medical condition. We'll find another role for you in the family business, something that doesn't require sensory abilities." The other role turned out to be working in the cellars. At 16, I started doing the manual labor of winemaking, cleaning barrels, moving cases, organizing inventory, maintaining equipment. I worked alongside the staff, doing the physical tasks that kept the winery operating but had nothing to do with the actual art of wine. My cousins, meanwhile, were sent to prestigious viticulture programs in France. They studied under master winemakers, did internships at famous chateaux, built networks in the international wine community. They returned to Rousseau Estates as rising stars, ready to take their places as the next generation of the family legacy. And I cleaned barrels. I told myself it was okay. I told myself that my grandfather had been wrong about me, that the gift he thought he saw was just wishful thinking, that I should be grateful to have any role at all given my medical limitations. But something didn't add up. Because I could still taste, I could still smell. When we opened a bottle of wine with dinner, I could identify the varietals, the aging, the terroir, all the things Dr. Castellane had said would be impossible for me. When we toured the vineyards, I could smell the difference between healthy vines and those developing disease. When we sampled vintages, I could detect the subtle notes that my cousins missed. I mentioned this to my uncle once, confused about how I could still perceive these things if I had ajusia. His explanation was smooth, practiced. What you're experiencing is psychological compensation. Your brain is filling in gaps with memories and suggestions from others. You're not actually tasting those notes. You're remembering what wine is supposed to taste like and convincing yourself you're experiencing it. It's common in patients with sensory deficits. I wanted to believe him, so I did. For years, I convinced myself that my perceptions weren't real, that I was imagining the complexity I detected, that my medical condition made me an unreliable observer of my own sensory experience. I was living in a prison made of lies, and I had been given the key to my own cell. The awakening came gradually, starting when I was 21 years old. I was working the night shift in the cellars. We often did overnight temperature monitoring during critical fermentation periods. I was alone, walking through the rows of barrels, when I noticed something wrong. One of the barrels smelled off, not dramatically but subtly, a note that didn't belong, a hint of something that suggested bacterial contamination. I checked the monitoring logs. Everything looked normal. Temperature was stable, humidity was controlled, all the measurable factors were within acceptable ranges. But I knew something was wrong. I reported it the next morning to the cellar master, Jean-Luc, an older man who had worked at Rousseau Estates for 30 years. Barrel 47 has contamination, I told him. I think it's Acetobacter. It's early stage, but it's there. Jean-Luc looked at me skeptically. The logs show everything normal. How can you tell? I can smell it. He actually laughed. Claire, no offense, but you can't smell anything. You have that condition, remember. You probably just think you smell something because... Please just check it, I interrupted. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. But if I'm right and we don't catch it now, we'll lose the entire barrel. He agreed, mostly to humor me. He drew a sample from barrel 47 and ran tests. The next day, he found me in the cellars, his expression strange. You were right, early stage Acetobacter contamination. We caught it in time to save the batch. If we'd waited another week, it would have spread. Oh, good. Claire, how did you know? The tests we run wouldn't have detected it for at least another few days, and you said you could smell it. I don't know. I thought I smelled something wrong, but my doctor said I can't really smell, so maybe I was just... Bullshit, Jean-Luc said bluntly. I've been making wine for 40 years. What you just did, that's not psychological compensation or lucky guessing. That's one of the best noses I've ever encountered. He studied me carefully. Has anyone ever actually tested your abilities? Not asked you to identify obvious things in front of your family, but really, scientifically tested what you can perceive. The specialist tested me when I was 15. That's when they diagnosed the ajusia. Who was the specialist? Dr. Castellane, my uncle found him. Jean-Luc's expression darkened. Your uncle found him, and this doctor concluded you have no sense of taste or smell, despite the fact that you just detected contamination that shouldn't have been perceptible yet. He was quiet for a moment. Claire, I want you to do something for me. I have a friend, Dr. Maria Santos, who is a legitimate expert in gustatory and olfactory function. She's at UC Davis, works with wine chemists and sensory scientists. Will you let me arrange for her to evaluate you, privately, without your uncle knowing? I should have said no. I should have trusted the diagnosis I'd received at 15, trusted my uncle's concern, trusted the family narrative. But something in Jean-Luc's tone, a combination of certainty and anger, made me agree. The evaluation happened 2 weeks later, on my day off. I drove to UC Davis and met Dr. Santos in her laboratory. She was younger than I expected, probably in her 40s, with the directness of someone who didn't waste time on politeness when truth mattered more. Jean-Luc tells me you've been diagnosed with ajusia, but he suspects the diagnosis is wrong. Tell me about the testing you received. I described the evaluation from 6 years earlier, the flavor identification, the smell tests, the final diagnosis. Dr. Santos made notes, her expression neutral. And you've experienced no symptoms, no difficulty tasting food, no inability to smell everyday odors. No, I'm told that what I think I'm tasting is psychological compensation. Who told you that? My uncle and Dr. Castellane. I see. Well, let's run some actual tests and see what we find. Over the next 3 hours, Dr. Santos put me through the most comprehensive sensory evaluation I'd ever experienced. She tested threshold detection, the minimum concentration at which I could perceive various compounds. She tested discrimination, my ability to distinguish between similar substances. She tested identification, whether I could correctly name what I was experiencing. When she finished, she sat down across from me with a stack of results. Claire, I'm going to be very direct with you. You don't have agesia. You don't have anosmia. Your sensory function is not just normal, it's exceptional. You're in approximately the 99.9 percentile for both gustatory and olfactory acuity. I stared at her. That's not possible, Dr. Castellane said. I don't know what Dr. Castellane said or why he said it. What I know is that your ability to detect and identify flavor compounds is among the best I've ever tested. You have what we call a supertaster profile, combined with an extraordinary sense of smell. This is the kind of sensory ability that professional perfumers and master sommeliers spend their entire lives trying to develop. You were born with it. She pulled out a document. I want you to read this. It's the diagnosis that Dr. Castellane supposedly provided 6 years ago. I skimmed the report. It described severe deficits in taste and smell perception, supported by test results showing I could barely identify common flavors. Now look at the test results I just generated. Compare them. The difference was staggering. Dr. Castellane's tests showed me functioning at maybe 20% capacity. Dr. Santos's tests showed me functioning at genius level. How is this possible? How could two evaluations be so different? One of two possibilities, Dr. Santos said carefully. Either Dr. Castellane is completely incompetent, which seems unlikely, given his credentials, or the evaluation you received 6 years ago was deliberately falsified. The implications crashed over me like a wave. Why would someone falsify a diagnosis? I can't answer that, but I can tell you that if someone wanted to prevent you from pursuing a career that required sensory abilities, say, in winemaking, convincing you that you were incapable would be an effective strategy. She handed me copies of all the test results. Whatever you do with this information is up to you. But Claire, you need to understand, you're not defective, you're gifted, and someone has spent 6 years making sure you didn't know that. I left UC Davis in a state of shock, the test results burning like evidence in my bag. Everything I had believed about myself was a lie. I wasn't noseblind. I wasn't incapable of appreciating wine. I was, according to Dr. Santos, one of the most naturally talented palates she had ever encountered. Which meant my grandfather had been right. I did have the gift. And my uncle had stolen it from me. The next several months were about processing a complete reconstruction of reality while maintaining the facade that nothing had changed. I continued working in the cellars, continued playing the role of the defective cousin who couldn't taste, but internally I was calculating, I was planning, and I was beginning to understand exactly what had been done to me. The timing of my diagnosis, 6 months after my grandfather's death, just as my uncle took control of the winery, was not coincidental. The medical evaluation that found deficits exactly severe enough to disqualify me from meaningful participation in the wine business was not accidental. The specialist my uncle had found was not randomly selected. It was all orchestrated, a systematic fraud designed to neutralize the threat I represented to André and Margit's inheritance. If I couldn't taste wine, I couldn't be a winemaker. If I couldn't be a winemaker, I couldn't claim my rightful place in the family business. If I couldn't participate meaningfully, the 20% stake my grandfather left me became just a financial instrument rather than actual power. They had stolen my future, my identity, and my inheritance in one elegant move. And I had helped them do it by believing their lies. The anger came slowly, building over weeks, but alongside the anger was something else, clarity. I knew what they had done, I knew why they had done it, and I was going to make them pay for every year they had stolen from me. But I needed to be smart. If I confronted them now, they would have time to cover their tracks, to destroy evidence, to construct a narrative that made me look like a delusional girl having a breakdown. No, I needed to build something first, something that would make me untouchable. I needed to become someone they couldn't dismiss. I started educating myself in earnest. I read everything I could find about wine, technical texts on viticulture and fermentation, histories of great vintages, critiques, and reviews from respected voices in the industry. I studied varietals, regions, aging techniques, blending philosophies. I also started tasting everything I could get my hands on. I used my minimal earnings to buy wines from different regions and price points. I would taste them blind, trying to identify not just what they were, but why they worked or didn't work. I was training my palate, honing the gift my grandfather had recognized and my uncle had tried to bury. Within a year, I could identify most wines by region and vintage from a single sip. I could detect flaws that professional sommeliers missed. I could predict how a young wine would develop with aging. I had become exactly what my grandfather had believed I could be. But I kept it completely hidden from my family. And then I started writing. I launched a blog under the pseudonym, The Palate, an anonymous wine review site that provided brutally honest critiques of wines across all price points and regions. I didn't reveal my identity, my background, or my location. I was just a voice offering insights that quickly became recognized as extraordinarily perceptive. My reviews were different from most wine criticism. I didn't use flowery language or pretentious metaphors. I was technical, specific, and uncompromising. I explained not just what a wine tasted like, but why it tasted that way, the decisions in the vineyard and the cellar that led to the final product. I also called out frauds, wines that were being praised by established critics but were actually mediocre, wineries that were trading on reputation rather than quality, the emperor's new clothes phenomena that plagued the industry. Within 2 years, the Palate had become one of the most influential voices in wine criticism. Sommeliers read my reviews before placing orders. Collectors sought out wines I recommended, and winemakers lived in fear of my assessments, because a negative review from the Palate could destroy a vintage's marketability overnight. I still worked in the Rousseau estate cellars. I still lived in a modest apartment. I still played the role of the defective cousin. But secretly, I had become one of the most powerful people in the wine industry. And I had very carefully avoided reviewing Rousseau estates wines. I was saving that for when the moment was perfect. The perfect moment came when I was 28 years old. Rousseau Estates had just released their flagship vintage, a 2019 Cabernet Sauvignon that my uncle Philippe was calling the finest wine in the estate's history. The wine had been created primarily by André, who had positioned himself as the new winemaking genius of the family. The early reviews were spectacular. Major publications gave it 95+ point scores. Sommeliers praised its complexity and elegance. Pre-orders were through the roof, with bottles selling for $400 each before they even reached the market. My family was triumphant. This was the vintage that would cement the next generation's legacy, that would prove André and Margit were worthy successors to Jean-Baptiste's vision. I requested a bottle for personal enjoyment, something I occasionally did, and which my family found touching in a pathetic way. The defective cousin who couldn't really appreciate wine still wanted to pretend. I took that bottle home, opened it carefully, and tasted it with the full focus of my trained palate. And I discovered something my family had missed. It was a fraud. The wine wasn't bad exactly, but it wasn't what it claimed to be. It was supposed to be estate-grown fruit from Rousseau vineyards, but I could detect flavor profiles that didn't match our terroir. André had blended in grapes from other sources, cheaper fruit from less prestigious regions, to increase yield while maintaining the price point. It was still a good wine, but it wasn't the exceptional, pure estate wine they were advertising. It was a lie in a bottle. And I was going to tell the world. I wrote the review carefully, precisely, with every ounce of technical expertise I had developed over 7 years of secret study. I described exactly what was in the wine, how it had been made, where the fruit had really come from. I explained how the blend was designed to fool most palates while cutting costs. And I concluded, Rousseau Estates' 2019 Cabernet Sauvignon is a study in dishonesty. The wine itself is competent, worth perhaps $80 per bottle, but at $400 and with claims of estate purity that are demonstrably false, this is fraud. The Rousseau family has built its reputation on uncompromising standards and authenticity. This vintage betrays that legacy. It is pretentious, derivative, and fundamentally dishonest, much like the people who made it. 1 star out of 5. I published the review on a Friday evening and watched the industry explode. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. The Palate's reviews were respected enough that major wine publications immediately began their own investigations. Within a week, independent testing confirmed what I had identified. The Rousseau 2019 Cabernet contained fruit from at least 3 non-estate sources. My uncle initially tried to deny it, claiming the testing was flawed, but André, under pressure, eventually admitted to the blending, claiming it was an innovative approach to achieving optimal flavor profile. The wine community was not impressed. Pre-orders were canceled by the thousands. Distributors demanded refunds. Wine magazines that had given 95+ scores published retractions and apologized for not catching the fraud. Worse, the revelation cast doubt on all of Rousseau Estate's recent vintages. If they had cheated on the flagship wine, what else were they lying about? Collectors started returning bottles. Restaurants pulled Rousseau wines from their lists. The estate's reputation, built over more than a century, was shattered in a matter of weeks. The financial impact was devastating. Rousseau Estates lost approximately $15 million in canceled orders and returned inventory. The value of their brand, which had been estimated at over $50 million, plummeted, and their access to credit, which they had been relying on to finance operations, evaporated as lenders became nervous about the scandal. Within 6 months, the family business was on the verge of bankruptcy. And I was still working in the cellars, watching it all burn down, saying nothing. The family had no idea I was the palate. No one did. My anonymity was absolute. But I knew, and I was preparing for the next phase. Because I wasn't just going to destroy them. I was going to take everything they had built on my stolen inheritance and make it mine. The acquisition opportunity came through a private equity contact I had cultivated over years of networking as the palate. Rousseau Estates needed approximately $30 million to survive, to pay off immediate debts, finance operations through the next harvest, and rebuild their damaged brand. They had been seeking investors for months without success. My contact suggested that I put together a consortium to acquire the estate. Given my knowledge of the wine industry, gained through my work as the palate, though he didn't know that was me, I would be the perfect person to restructure the business and restore its reputation. I formed an investment vehicle called Terroir Capital, structured through multiple layers of holding companies that obscured my involvement. Through Terroir Capital, I made an offer, $5 million cash for complete ownership of Rousseau Estates, including all assets, brands, inventory, and vineyards. It was an insultingly low offer for a property that had once been valued at $80 million, but given their desperate situation, it was their only option. My uncle Philippe tried to negotiate for better terms, but I had positioned Terroir Capital as the only viable buyer. Every other potential investor had been quietly discouraged through my network in the wine industry. After 3 months of negotiations, they accepted. The closing was scheduled for a Tuesday in November. The meeting would formalize the acquisition, transfer all assets, and officially end more than 120 years of Rousseau family ownership. My uncle believed he was selling to a faceless investment group. He had negotiated consulting contracts for himself and executive positions for André and Margit, thinking he was engineering a soft landing. He had no idea what was coming. I arrived at the meeting exactly on time, dressed in clothes that cost more than I had earned in a year of cellar work. I was flanked by attorneys and accompanied by Jean-Luc, who had been helping me prepare for this moment since the day he first suspected I had been lied to. The conference room fell silent when I walked in. My uncle's face went through a rapid sequence of expressions: confusion, recognition, disbelief, and finally horror. "Claire, what are you doing here? You're supposed to be working." "Good afternoon, Uncle Philippe," I said calmly. "I'm here to finalize the acquisition of Rousseau Estates by Terroir Capital. As the founder and majority owner of Terroir Capital, I'll be taking possession of all assets today." Complete silence. André found his voice first. "That's impossible. You're a cellar worker. You don't have money to buy anything." "Actually, I'm a highly successful wine critic and industry consultant. I'm also the person known as the Palate, the critic who exposed your fraudulent 2019 Cabernet and destroyed this estate's reputation over the past 6 months." I pulled out a folder and began distributing documents. "These are the acquisition agreements your attorney negotiated on your behalf. Terroir Capital purchases all Rousseau Estates assets for $5 million, assumes all liabilities, and takes full operational control. The current management, including all family members, will be terminated effective immediately." My uncle was shaking his head frantically. "You can't be the Palate. You're nose blind. You have ajuja. You can't even taste wine." "I never had ajuja. I said coldly. That diagnosis was fabricated by Dr. Raymond Castellane, who you paid to lie about my sensory abilities so you could steal my inheritance and eliminate me as competition for Andre and Margit. I pulled out another set of documents, Dr. Santos's evaluation from 7 years ago, showing my exceptional abilities. I've known the truth since I was 21. I've spent the past 7 years developing my palate, building my reputation as the palate, and positioning myself to take back everything you stole from me. I turned to my attorneys. These documents also include a civil lawsuit seeking compensation for fraud, medical battery based on the falsified diagnosis, and recovery of my original inheritance, which was improperly diverted. The total claim is $25 million. My Aunt Celeste was crying. Margit looked like she might be sick. Andre was staring at me as if seeing me for the first time. This isn't just about the money, I continued. It's about the identity you stole. You convinced me I was defective when I was gifted. You buried my potential for 17 years because I threatened your children's inheritance. You made me believe I was broken so you could profit from my grandfather's faith in me. I met my uncle's eyes. Grandfather was right, I do have the gift. I have the best palate in this family. Better than yours, better than Andre's, better than anyone who's ever worked at this estate. And I'm going to use that gift to rebuild what you destroyed. The consulting contracts, my uncle started desperately, are void. You negotiated them in bad faith, and they were contingent on the buyers being an unrelated third party. Since I'm the buyer and the rightful heir to this estate, those contracts are worthless. I stood up, preparing to leave. You have 48 hours to vacate all company property. Anything left behind will be disposed of. Security will escort you out of the building within the hour. I paused at the door. Oh, and one more thing. The 20% stake grandfather left me. It's still mine. I never legally lost it, since the medical diagnosis used to sideline me was fraudulent. Combined with the 60% I just purchased, I now own 80% of Rousseau Estates outright. The remaining 20% will be offered to Jean-Luc and the staff who actually kept this place running while you were destroying it with your fraud and incompetence. I looked at my uncle one final time. You tried to make me invisible. You tried to convince everyone, including me, that I didn't matter, that I couldn't contribute, that I should be grateful for whatever scraps you threw me. But I became the most powerful voice in the industry you tried to exclude me from, and now I own everything you built with the inheritance you stole. Grandfather left me this estate because he saw my potential. You spent 17 years trying to bury that potential. I spent 7 years proving him right. Enjoy your retirement, Uncle Philippe. I'm sure it will give you plenty of time to reflect on your mistakes. I walked out of the conference room and into the Napa sunshine, feeling lighter than I had in 17 years. The estate that had been stolen from me was finally mine. And I was just getting started. The next several years were about transformation of the estate and of myself. I rehired many of the staff who had been mistreated under my uncle's management, including Jean-Luc, who became my head winemaker. Together, we began the process of restoring Rousseau Estates to the standards my grandfather had established. We ripped out the shortcuts. We returned to estate-only fruit. We implemented rigorous quality controls. We started making wine the way it was supposed to be made, with integrity, with patience, with uncompromising standards. I also revealed my identity as the palate, something I did carefully, through a feature article in a major wine magazine. The revelation that the industry's most feared critic was a 28-year-old woman who had been dismissed as noseblind and forced to work in cellars became one of the biggest stories in the wine world. The article included everything: the fraudulent diagnosis, the stolen inheritance, the 17 years of exploitation, the careful building of expertise while pretending to be defective. It was my story, told in my own words with full documentation. The response was overwhelming. Other people came forward with similar stories of being excluded from family businesses through fraudulent medical diagnoses. The wine industry began examining its own biases about who was considered capable of the gift. And Dr. Castellane's medical license was suspended pending an investigation into his role in my fraudulent diagnosis. As for my family, they faded into obscurity. My uncle attempted to salvage some dignity by claiming he had been misled by Dr. Castellane, that he had genuinely believed I was disabled. No one believed him. The evidence of deliberate fraud was too overwhelming, the timing too convenient, the financial motive too obvious. Andre tried to start his own winemaking venture, but the palate's scathing reviews of his previous work haunted him. He eventually left the wine industry entirely and now works in tech sales in San Jose. Margaret moved to New York and married into a banking family. We don't speak. My Aunt Celeste divorced my uncle 2 years after the acquisition and reached out to me once, asking if we could talk. We met at a coffee shop, neutral territory. She looked smaller than I remembered, diminished by the scandal and the divorce. I didn't know, she said immediately, about the fake diagnosis, about the plan to steal your inheritance. Philippe kept all of that from me. I just thought you really were limited, and I'm so sorry I never questioned it. I listened, trying to assess her sincerity. Did you really not know, or did you just not want to know because ignorance was more comfortable? She flinched, maybe both. I knew Philippe was obsessed with securing André and Margot's inheritance. I knew he saw you as a threat, but I told myself he would never actually hurt you, that whatever he was doing was legal and ethical. I chose to trust him instead of protecting you. I was a child, I said quietly. I was grieving my grandfather, trying to find my place in the world, and instead of helping me, instead of questioning a diagnosis that came at such a convenient time, you just accepted the narrative that made your children's future more secure. I know, and I can't undo that, but I wanted you to know that I see it now. I see what was done to you, what I allowed to happen through my willful blindness, and I'm sorry. I didn't forgive her that day. I'm not sure I ever fully will, but I appreciated her honesty, and I told her that any relationship we might rebuild would take years and would require consistent proof that she had truly changed. We exchange occasional emails now. It's not close, but it's not completely severed either. As for my uncle Philippe, he tried to sue for wrongful termination and illegal acquisition. His lawsuits were dismissed with prejudice. The evidence of his fraud was so overwhelming that the judge sanctioned his attorneys for bringing frivolous claims. He declared personal bankruptcy 3 years after the acquisition and now lives in a modest apartment in Sacramento, surviving on Social Security. I hear about him occasionally through mutual acquaintances. I don't reach out, I don't gloat. I simply exist in a reality where he's irrelevant. The estate flourished under my management. We released our first vintage under my leadership 3 years after the acquisition. I named it Grand-Père, grandfather, in honor of Jean-Baptiste. It was everything he had believed I could create: elegant, complex, honest. The palate reviewed it and gave it 5 stars. Yes, I reviewed my own wine, something I did transparently, explaining that I was evaluating my work with the same uncompromising standards I applied to everyone else. The wine sold out within hours. Critics who tasted it called it one of the best California Cabernets of the decade. More importantly, it was honest. Every grape was estate-grown. Every decision in its creation was made with integrity. It was the opposite of everything André had created with the fraudulent 2019 vintage. It was the wine my grandfather had dreamed I would make. Over the next several years, Rousseau Estates rebuilt its reputation completely. We became known not just for excellent wines, but for radical transparency. We published detailed information about our processes, our sourcing, our decisions. We were the antidote to the pretension and dishonesty that plagued parts of the industry. I also used my platform to advocate for reform. I spoke at industry conferences about gatekeeping, about how talent is often dismissed or hidden when it doesn't fit convenient narratives. I funded scholarships for young winemakers from non-traditional backgrounds. I pushed for better protections against guardianship abuse. I became not just a winemaker, but a voice for everyone who had been told they didn't belong. At 35, I sold 40% of Rousseau Estates to a luxury conglomerate for $120 million. I retained controlling interest and operational authority, but the investment gave us resources to expand into new markets and establish the estate as a global brand. My personal net worth exceeded $80 million, $10 times the inheritance my grandfather had left me, earned through my own abilities rather than just inherited wealth. But the number that mattered most to me was different: 17. 17 years they had stolen from me. 17 years I had spent believing I was broken. I couldn't get those years back, but I could make sure they counted for something. I established the Jean-Baptiste Rousseau Foundation, dedicated to supporting people who had been excluded from their potential through medical fraud, family manipulation, or systematic dismissal of their abilities. The foundation funds free sensory testing for anyone who suspects their diagnosis might be wrong. It provides legal support for people fighting fraudulent guardianships. It offers scholarships and mentorship for young people entering fields they've been told they're not capable of mastering. Every person the foundation helps is a small victory over the lies that almost destroyed me. Today, I'm 42 years old. I run one of the most respected wineries in America. I'm married to a brilliant woman I met at a wine industry conference, a sommelier who treats my palate as the gift it is rather than a threat to be neutralized. We have a daughter. She's 5 years old, and she already shows signs of having inherited the gift. When we open wine at dinner, she asks to smell it. When we walk through the vineyards, she notices subtle differences in the fruit. And I tell her every day that whatever her talents are, they matter, that no one has the right to tell her she's less than she is, that her perceptions are real and valuable. I'm teaching her to trust herself in ways I wasn't allowed to for 17 years. Last week, I did something I hadn't done in years. I visited my grandfather's grave. I brought a bottle of Grand Peer, the wine I had named in his honor, the wine that represented everything he had believed I could create. I sat by his headstone and opened the bottle, pouring a small amount onto the ground in the French tradition. "You were right," I said quietly. "I did have the gift. They tried to hide it, tried to convince everyone, including me, that you were wrong, but you weren't." The wind moved through the vineyard that surrounded the small family cemetery. "I got it back, Grand Peer. The estate, the gift, the future you wanted for me. It took longer than it should have. It was harder than it needed to be, but I got it back." I poured myself a small glass of the wine and tasted it, detecting every note, every decision, every element that made it what it was. Perfect. This is what you taught me to create. This is the legacy you wanted me to carry forward, and I'm doing it, not because I inherited the right, but because I earned it. I sat there for a while longer, feeling the connection to the man who had seen me clearly when everyone else had been looking away. Then I drove back to the estate, my estate, where Jean-Luc was waiting to discuss the upcoming harvest, where my wife was planning the foundation's next fundraiser, where my daughter was probably making a mess in the tasting room. The place they had tried to steal from me was home now, not because I had won it back through revenge, though there was satisfaction in that, but because I had proven, beyond any doubt, that the gift my grandfather recognized was real. They tried to make me invisible. I became the most powerful voice in the industry. They tried to convince me I was broken. I became exceptional. They tried to steal my future. I created a better one than they could have imagined. That's my story. That's my victory. In every wine I make, every person my foundation helps, every day I wake up knowing who I really am. That's another way of saying, "You were wrong about me, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving it." If you made it all the way to the end, you're not just a viewer. You're someone who understands what it means to have your reality manipulated, to be told you're less than you are, to fight back against impossible odds. Like this video right now, if Claire's journey moved you. If you felt the weight of those 17 stolen years, if you cheered when she walked into that boardroom, if you felt satisfaction when she revealed she was the palate, hit that like button. And subscribe to this channel. Bell.